Hello and welcome to North Country Matters. My name is Donna Seymour. I'm a member of the St. Lawrence County branch of the American Association of University Women, one of the civic partners for this show. Today we're holding a conversation with Blue Carreker from Citizens Action New York about the childcare crisis in New York State. Blue, it's great to have you back on North Country Matters. It's nice to be able to take advantage of your expertise one more time.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, so Blue is the Upstate Organizer for Citizen Action, and she's worked on many of the issues that surround women's economic security for Citizens Action. And today we're going to be talking about childcare, which is in crisis. It isn't just in crisis in New York State, it's in this country. Nearly half of American households with an employed mother and a child under 5 report using a paid child care provider, according to a 2015 report from the Nonpartisan Committee for Economic Development. Paid child care is a key part of allowing parents, especially mothers, to participate in the labor force. And yet many families are unable to access enough or affordable child care. So let's talk for a minute, Blue, about just how expensive child care is and when you can find it in the first place, which isn't always easy, is it?
No, it's not easy at all. And, you know, we had talked before about paid family leave, and it's wonderful that we have that program now, but okay, you're done with your paid family leave, and now you need to go back to work, and what happens with your child? And child care, as the cost of it continues to climb rapidly, so that a year of child care is now equivalent or sometimes more than a year of college tuition. So you can
which you could at least borrow for, which you can't for child care.
No, you cannot. You cannot. So, you know, and that is increasing every year. Mm-hmm. The amount of income that comes to child care providers, you know, what we're able to pay and what is available to those centers through any kind of support or assistance from any level of government is so small that daycare providers are paid some of the lowest pay of any kind of professional staff, and they tend to lose those providers a lot as people are able to find something else that gives them a greater income. So it's a real struggle to be a child care provider, which means that the number of affordable child care places that are available is limited, and then the cost is very high. And yet we know women are now in the workforce. They have to be. Families have a very difficult time existing without both parents working. There is a formula that was put together based on market circumstances that says, you know, how much do you need to have as a family to be able to afford child care, and what would you have to earn to be able to get a subsidy, some kind of help that makes child care affordable for you. That was determined quite a few years ago, and ever since it was determined in New York, we only are able to meet and provide subsidies to about 17% of those families that actually would qualify under this formula. So, great formula based on real facts, but we can't come anywhere into meeting that.
So those 83% of families who don't qualify, and of course that number is not static, it has not stayed at whatever it was determined at, it's only gone up in time. Right. So we're putting people behind the 8 ball, we're putting people at the lowest end of the economic ladder behind the 8 ball, and they have the fewest resources to start with, and they are the most likely to absolutely need to have 2 people from the household working. Right. And yet we've made it impossible for them to do that in a way that allows them to meet their needs of their children.
And New York is some of the highest care and some of the least affordable care. It's been a number of years, I think, since they figured out, you know, what the average was, and we know that it's gone up since then, but it was about $7,500 per year back in 2011. So,
and that's for one child.
That's for one child.
Not for 2 or more.
And of course, infant care is there's far fewer providers, and it's far more expensive care. So yes, there's a very big crisis, and a crisis that for a number of years, our legislators and our governor don't really seem to feel is important to address.
And part of that reason is because who is sitting in those seats in Albany? For the most part, it's people of a different generation. Mm-hmm. It's people who are not likely to have ever been caregivers in the first place, and they had somebody at home who was balancing and juggling all that stuff. I think if we had a legislature full of young career women with children, we have a very different public policy priority when it came to funding childcare.
Well, I think that could be true on a lot of different issues. We'd also need some low-income women in there because, you know, what we do get, as we got this year, and the governor was very proud of the fact that he gave a tax incentive, which I think would put a couple $100 more in the pockets of middle-income families who pay for child care. So, you know, that's nice. I don't think it's, you know, I'm not going to say that's a bad thing. You know, I was a middle-income parent, and any $100 and less than my tax was $100, you know. But that only really impacts families that make $50,000 or more. And families who are making less than that, as we've said, what are they doing? They're dropping out of the workforce and dropping into poverty. They're putting their children in the care of other older children who they're taking out of the school system. They're putting in the care of grandparents or people who may not have the energy or ability to provide a full day's care when it's needed. They're juggling. The father is at work in the day and the mother is at work as a nurse all night. They never see each other. All of these kinds of things are happening in order to have children watched, because of course if your children aren't watched, well then you can be arrested for child neglect and abuse. So
it's hard to win.
It's very hard to win when you're struggling at the lower ends of our income.
We had Bob Gorman on the show a few weeks ago, and Bob is the executive director of the United Way of the North Country, and he talked about the United Way's ALICE report, which details the cost of childcare for every county in the state. And ALICE itself stands for the Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed. In other words, the working poor. Right. And here in St. Lawrence County, the cost of childcare for a family of 4 that includes an infant and a preschooler is $1,200. In order to meet that, and all the other basic necessities of life, like childcare and transportation and housing and you name it, you'd have to have an annual income of $57,500. Well, there are not a lot of those jobs going begging here in St. Lawrence County, and that's one of the reasons why 52% of this county is struggling according to the ALICE measure. So this is not anything that is unique to St. Lawrence County. There's huge impacts because of the costs and the lack of child care that's having on the families of New York State, and it's also impacting our ability to be an economic powerhouse as a state, isn't it? Because we've hamstrung our families.
Yes. I mean, if you want families to work, and there's a lot of rhetoric you hear about how we achieve economic development. And we're willing to give lots of incentives to companies, and we're willing to give tax break to companies, but companies need employees. And so how are we allowing, and what are we doing to help our families be able to work, and or to be able even to go to school to get the skills and training they need to do the proper work while balancing a family? And we make that increasingly difficult. And then we pay, of course, down the line. We pay because people are not in the workforce. We pay because children are not exposed to an early learning environment, and they're exposed instead to very stressful situations often. And they come into a school system perhaps without the social skills or with proper early brain development or early preparation that would allow us to teach. And then our schools have to be not just education facilities, they need to be social and mental health facilities and service facilities and all those kind of things that we struggle with. How do we fund our schools to do all these things? But if we had made that work-family balance more appropriate and available, then we would have far fewer problems when those kids actually got into the school system.
What business and government fail to realize is that investing in childcare and early learning is actually investing in the economic strength of the state.
That's right.
And we have the opportunity to change a whole lot of dynamics. Kids that come into kindergarten not ready to learn are often, when they graduate from high school going into college classes, also not ready to learn. And we know the remedial costs of college is huge. And that does go right back onto the individual and the family trying to send that student to college because they spend so much of their time playing catch up. And so that is, that works for nobody. That is not something that helps anybody. And you know, it's a struggle to find daycare and childcare and early learning slots as it is. But the lack of childcare is a special problem in rural areas, isn't it? Because of the lack of population density and the lack of the kinds of supports that you sometimes get in the more populous urban areas and in the wealthier suburban areas.
That's very, very true, and just creates incredible economic and mental stress on families. So, yeah, how do we do, you know, we have big amount of change to accomplish here. And again, we were talking the last time we got together about that 3 phases of power and the fact that we have to change the laws, we need to get more funding and assistance into the system. You know, we need to also change cultural norms. In many parts of Europe, there's child care provision is a recognized and respected profession. You know, you expect to have people taking care of children who have important degrees and a good solid background. They are paid well. The positions are ones that are sought after.
And respected by society.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which then, of course, employs a lot of people and helps to create a more solid middle class. So how do we as a society take a look at the caregiving side of our economy and make it more respected, better paid, and more professionalized? Right,
and an attractive field to go into and an attractive field to create a business to serve that need.
That's right.
There's in a lot of places, if you don't have a commercial daycare to go to, then you may rely on family members, or you may rely on someone who's doing daycare in the home. Well, in order to be accredited, you have to go through a number of inspections and applications and things like that, and that can be quite daunting for people, can't it? To meet the requirements.
To be a certified child care.
It can be a very daunting process because we need the regulations in order to provide a safe and healthy environment, but the regulations themselves then become a barrier for a lot of folks, don't they? Because it's so hard to meet.
Also, and because there's no funding along with it. So, yes, it's important, and the federal government keeps increasing the quality standards for child care provisions. And just a simple example, they're about to require that all child care providers have fingerprinting and you know, research, but
background checks,
right? So each one of those checks costs like $1,000, and that's now, you know, they're telling you who's paying that $1,000 for every employee, you know, in an industry that's already struggling.
Exactly, and in an industry where if you are an individual trying to provide a service to families in your area, that's a lot of money to come up with, and it's with no help and no supporting. You can't just go to your families and say, oh, by the way, I'm going to need an extra $1,000 in the next week so I can continue my certification. The other thing that finger-bound background check is coming in New York State next fall, and it won't just be for the daycare providers, it will be for any adult in that household. So it may be a multiple expense, and starting in this September, there's going to be a 5-hour health and safety training, which is not going to be a big deal, except when you look at St. Lawrence County, how many places maybe don't have high-speed internet? It's online training, but you have to be able to have the time to sit down and do the training, and you've got to be able to have the internet access. And one of the things that we know is that everything that the government is doing, both at the state level and at the federal level, is requiring you to have the kind of internet infrastructure that lots of rural places still don't have. So you're in this terrible catch-22. So how do we create a system, Blue, that makes childcare a job that is actually affordable, and how do we encourage people to go into that industry, to provide those business opportunities? You know, we say we want to create business in the state, and yet this is the kind of mom and pop operation that there seems to be almost no support for, doesn't it? We're not a big corporation, we're not coming in from somewhere else, we're not going to create 1,000 jobs, and we fall through almost all the cracks of the system.
Yeah, and I think there's going to be have to be an investment about it. You know, there was a lot of talk at the end of the presidential campaign about infrastructure, you know, and how important it is and how we've neglected infrastructure and across the country. And of course they're talking about bridges and roads and all those things. But we have a social infrastructure, and we have neglected the social infrastructure just as much as we have neglected, if not more, our physical infrastructure. So what is that social infrastructure? And it is things like paid family leave. It's adjusting our economy to the fact that women are a part of the workforce, and that families can no longer live on one income. So what are we doing in our workplaces and in our public policies to support a better work-family balance, so that our children, our infants, and our children as they prepare for school and in school are getting the grounding and the family support and the educational learning preparation that they need, so that the people who are providing that are well trained and professional, that is provided in an environment that's safe. And it's going to take some financial investment, but the payoff is huge. Right. But we have not been able to educate and get our legislators on board that way, and I think it's going to take the involvement of families. We were again the last time talking about that face of power of the second phase, which is engagement, and actually people participating in the democratic process, feeling able to go and advocate for what they need as a family. And I think that's what's got to happen. Right. As you said, the people we're talking to don't necessarily have the personal experience. Exactly. And they need to hear from our families. They need to hear from our parents. They need to hear from business owners whose employees are struggling with these impossible situations. Right, and workers in stress are not providing the best possible return to their employers because they can't. You can't be pulled in 6 different directions and expect them to just say, well, I'm not going to think about my baby or grandma or anybody else that needs me until I go home after work, because those things are running in the back of your mind all the time about who needs what and how do we make sure it happens. So just to let you know where we are with the government, so there is a number of different coalitions working on getting child care funding and advocating for providers particularly, and for the those who provide it. So you have a coalition statewide called Winning Beginnings. The Schuyler Center, which is a lot of research, is very involved in it. There's a whole group of labor unions in New York City that are involved in things, and they work with a program called Facilitated Enrollment. So Winning Beginnings works with subsidies. So these are 2 different pots of money, and this is another problem in advocating, because the system of child care is fractured in so many different ways, different kinds of providers, different kinds of daycare centers, different streams of money that come from federal to state to county and are dispersed in different ways. So complex system for parents to navigate, complex system for us to figure out how to fix. Right. But this year, Winning Beginning went into the legislature saying, we need $1 million just to keep the same amount of slots, subsidized slots, available to families. It wasn't $1 million, it was $100 million. I'm sorry. No, sorry. If it was $1 million, it would have been easy. You're right. I'm very sorry. You're right. $100 million, right? just to keep those 13%, 17% of our
Right.
families
Which,
in care.
as we know, is a drop in the bucket
Right.
of need.
Okay, they did not get the 100 million. In fact, their total money was cut by $27 million in the last couple of weeks of negotiation. And they pulled out all the stops, went back in, and they narrowed that to 7 million. So in the end, they lost only 7 million. But again, all they were doing was trying to keep the current crisis from boiling over. And facilitated enrollment is a small pot of money that helps parents who get an increase in pay and maybe by $200 or $300, $400, get out of the income requirements, and they surpass the income requirements for the subsidy. So I talked to a parent who finally got into subsidized care and then got a slight increase in their job at work, made $250 more than they should in the annual thing, and were about to get kicked out of childcare.
Right, and they still didn't have enough money to make up the difference. So they were still behind that
So this is a
eight ball,
small amount
as
of
we
money
said.
that's available in some areas upstate to do that. They needed $25 million to keep those pots available, and they got cut too. So clearly the message is not getting through.
No, it isn't. And you know, it isn't just infant care and preschool care. There's also the whole side of the after-school care, because you've got kids that can't go home to an empty house because mom and dad are still working. And so what do we do with them? And that's...
We did get some increase in after-school
There
care.
there are some increases
this year.
Yeah,
so
there are some increases, but mostly in the urban areas. So that makes it tough to fill the need in more rural places like St. Lawrence County. We've seen some creative solutions locally. Potsdam Central School started an after-school program last fall for their students. We had a program here on North Country Matters with 4-H, and they're doing some after-school programming. They have a program at their learning farm in Canton for kids in the Canton School District who can be bused to their facility. And they have a couple of programs that they're running in more rural school districts, but all this is grant-driven. So if the grants dry up, then the funding for these programs dries up, but the need never goes away. In New York State, there are 3.5 million children under the age of 15 who might need some form of child care services. Those slots don't exist in many places. You can't leave kids at home who are too young to be there safely, and yet we know in some cases that's probably happening because of the fact that we don't have a system that really is meeting people's needs. And heaven help the family who has a snow day that they can't prepare for ahead of time, and that's one of the hardest things to prepare for is a day when school is closed, which isn't on the calendar. So. So there's all kinds of things that we need to think about when it comes to child care. But what a difference it would make, again to go back to your 3 stages of power, if we had that cultural shift where we were putting the needs of families with children first. And it isn't, of course, just families with children, because we now know families are also struggling on the other end with elder care. And things like paid family leave help, but it doesn't mean that families with elder care issues don't also need programs for them, does it? So I mean, we have the same thing at both ends of the age spectrum. There are not enough places that are good, safe programs for people who need supervision. So,
well, we need as we said before, a workplace that acknowledges that the current environment. You know, most of Europe adjusted after World War II. When women started coming into the workplace, and the economy shifted so that both parents in a family were needed to bring in enough income. And there were more and more single parent households that obviously needed that income and needed that flexibility. So there are robust programs throughout all of Europe to support parents with childcare, with the flexibility that they need to balance their work requirements and their family requirements. Somehow we are still stuck in a workplace model that thinks we're still back in the 50s, with middle-income families in the 50s. Because, of course, even in the 50s, if you were low income, you were struggling anyway.
Right.
But
I like to remind people that if they think that the Ozzie and Harriet family was the model, Harriet worked.
yeah.
So people tend to forget that when we think about, and it seems like so many of our policymakers are stuck back in the 1950s and the 1960s. And let's face it, the jobs of the 1960s aren't there anymore. I mean, a lot of jobs have changed. And what we see coming out of the new administration is a complete disinterest in investing in the social infrastructure that you mentioned before. They want to beef up the military infrastructure and they want to create jobs on that side, but they seem to be shrinking all the money that would go into the programs that support families and that would help, especially our lower income folks, become more successful.
Well, my faith is in the next generation. I mean, I have two boys, one in his late 20s and the other in his early 30s. Both boys want to be a part of families, and they want to be able to have a quality of life with their family that they felt they experienced. They want jobs that recognize that they have families and that they have a life and that their career and their job is not their entire life.
Right.
And that supports that environment, and they both, work really hard to find employers that understand and recognize that circumstance. And that also they're very, they pay attention a lot to how women are treated and advocate for more equality in the workplace. And I think time is on our side, but we still have a lot of people that are clinging hard to an old system.
Well, it wouldn't hurt at all if in 2018, when the entire New York State legislature is up for re-election, if a few younger people of both persuasions decided to run for office, because they'd be bringing those 21st century attitudes into the legislature, which would make it a whole lot easier to advocate for things like childcare, which have gotten pretty short shrift up till now.
Yep.
So
we need a lot of women and a lot of younger people.
That's right.
Considering running for election. I agree.
And that would certainly be a help. And clearly, the same thing is true in the business model, that we need a less patriarchal business leadership class, and we know there are very few slots at the highest levels for women now. So again, and we've seen change in some companies. When women have gotten to the top, they sometimes do make those kinds of cultural shift changes that are going to be needed to create those family-friendly workplaces that are going to be critical if we're going to be a successful society. We're really talking about how do we want to be successful as a society here. It isn't just solving the childcare crisis, it's about who do we want to be as a people.
Exactly. And I always go back, what is my experience, what was my parents' experience, look at our lives and how do the structures of our economy support the quality of life that we want, or how do they put barriers up to the quality of life that we want. And when they're put up barriers, we need to talk to our legislators. There are people like you and me. They need to hear from us, and they need to know what is happening in the day-to-day lives of all of us and how they can work to make our lives easier, to make us more productive. If we have good jobs, we spend money in our communities, that builds up the community. So, I'm a big advocate for more civic participation.
Absolutely, and creating those child care slots is good for business, it's good for our families, it's good for our society. So let's make that a priority and think about what we need to do in a structural sense to support those folks who want to go into this industry.
Exactly.
All right. Well, Blue, thank you for coming in today. It's been another great conversation. Citizens Action has its fingers in many, many advocacy pies, and you have so much experience, and we're grateful that you're willing to share it with us.
Well, I always love coming up here, so.
Well, we'll get you back, don't worry.
Good. Next time when it's warm enough and I can bring a kayak.
Yes, absolutely. We may even have a kayak for you. You don't have to drag one up here. So these conversations are a production of North Country Matters, which is filmed here in the Potsdam Public Library's Fred W. Cleveland Computer Center. The show is a civic collaboration between the St. Lawrence County branch of the American Association of University Women, the St. Lawrence County unit of the League of Women Voters, and the Potsdam Public Library. Until next time, remember, our North Country matters. Thank you again. Another great show.